Good evening and welcome to Primetime Lawmakers, GPB's nightly coverage of the Georgia General Assembly for Thursday, February 2nd, 2012, the 13th legislative day of the 2012 session. I'm Scott Slade, and coming up on tonight's program, the constitutional amendment to allow state-sponsored charter schools clears an important hurdle. State-sponsored charter schools were declared unconstitutional by the Georgia Supreme Court last year. The $18.5 billion 2012 amended budget passes House Appropriations. That's a big step on the way to final passage. The spending bill is expected to be taken up by the full House tomorrow. It's Education Week on Lawmakers, part of GPB's ongoing effort to improve the graduation rate in the state. Tonight's topic, inequality in rural schools. I'll be joined on set by Representative Brooks Coleman and Representative Amy Carter, both from the House Education Committee. And for some in-depth analysis of today's Capitol news, we'll welcome in Walter Jones from Morris News Service to talk about some hot-button issues. All that and more is coming up tonight on Primetime Lawmakers, but first we go live to the Capitol, where the proposed charter schools constitutional amendment has cleared its first hurdle. Sandra Parrish is there.
Thanks, Scott. The constitutional amendment was, of course, brought after a decision by the state Supreme Court last year that ruled it was unconstitutional for local school systems to have to pay for state-commissioned charter schools. As a result, 10 such schools lost half their funding this year.
I am simply taking us back to where I believe prior to that decision, every one of us would have thought the Constitution would be interpreted.
The measure by House Speaker Pro Tem Jan Jones passed on a vote of 15-6. It would require local school systems like Fulton Leadership Academy, a 2-year-old state-commissioned charter school, to receive local funding in addition to state funds. Principal Gavin Sams tells me the school's money was cut in half by the court's ruling.
Just wind up cutting back in many ways. You have to pay people less. You can't run as many programs. You're basically on a shoestring budget, and you're just trying to make ends meet. So it's pretty tough.
Because his is an all-boys school, the Fulton County School Board would not approve it.
That was something that they were concerned about, but the state is able to do that and create the balance. So if it were not for the state commission, we would not have been able to have a school for all boys. And quite frankly, the way boys have been sort of turning out their results lately, it's important that we figure out how to help them do much better.
But local school systems are not happy with the amendment.
We believe that if the local Board of Education approves the charter, it's approved by the state, then we certainly need to share in the funding of it. But if the local Board of Education turns that down and the state chooses to commission or approve that school, then we believe they should pay for it with state money.
Gwinnett County Schools was among several Metro Atlanta school systems that filed that original suit. Mr. Wilbanks tells me he is confident that should the constitutional amendment pass the legislature, voters will not approve it. The Small Business and Job Creation Committee held its first Red Tape Watch meeting today. We told you last week the effort, initiated by House Speaker David Ralston, is to review the state regulations that make it difficult for small businesses to operate. We heard from Roy Taylor, an investor from Valdosta, who's found it difficult to buy and renovate old buildings.
A building today, just a little 3-person office. You have sent us regulations down that says we must put a water fountain in there that people might drink water out of a water fountain. Now we know that a $250 water cooler is more sanitary, no waste in it. You go out to Walmart or Sam's and buy it, install it, they bring the water. Now that water fountain costs an average of $2,000 to put in an old building as well as a new building. And on a $200,000 building, that ran that cost up 3.5%, that one little item. We don't need any more regulations. We don't need any more ordinances.
And of course, Roy Taylor said that he was most concerned that the unemployment rate in Valdosta is up to 17%. He said these regulations are making it difficult to do some hiring. That committee heard from other small business owners for more than 2 hours this afternoon. They'll be having more public hearings as well. Reporting live, I'm Sandra Parrish for Primetime Lawmakers.
All right, thanks very much, Sandra. House Democrats held a public hearing today to promote Georgia's economic security, highlighting legislative plans to promote a stronger economy through job creation, small business incentives, and keeping Georgia's parks afloat. Now, key items included the Georgia Buy American Act, which reduces sales taxes on products made in America and Georgia. Other legislation proposed included the Rural Recovery Act of 2012, which would immediately repeal what Georgia Democrats call the failed immigration bill, HB 87, passed in 2011. They argued that the implementation of HB 87 has devastated much of Georgia's farms and agriculture. Other highlights included the Rural Tourism Protection Act, which mandates prior notice of park closures. Parks, the House Democrats argue, create good Georgia jobs and promote local rural tourism. With this bill, parks may be able to stay open with more state assistance. And lastly, Representative Pat Gardner presented the Georgia Health Care Relief Act, noting that there are nearly 2 million people in Georgia without health care coverage. This bill is meant to help Georgia control its health care costs through the Georgia Health Insurance Marketplace, which facilitates small business enrollment in health insurance plans. Today's public hearing is one of several presented by House Democrats. Our Keosha Howard is standing by live at the Capitol with the latest on fiscal year 2012, the amended budget. Keosha, any movement today?
Good evening, Scott. Today, the House Appropriations Committee passed the 2012 supplemental budget. Increase in the state's rainy day account helps fund education growth. House Appropriations Chair Terry England.
Once it gets to a certain level in funds, you can go in and pull 1% out of the rainy day fund to use for midterm adjustment on K-12 education growth. So you got systems that grew beyond what was projected earlier in the year. That money goes to fund those extra students, and also part of that money is used for training and experience of our teachers.
The amended budget also includes funding for criminal justice projects and additional money for agriculture, which some say has suffered since the passage of Georgia's illegal immigration law last year.
There is about $6 million put in Department of Corrections for opening the Bostic facility down at Milledgeville to take nursing home eligible patients out of the prison system and put them in nursing care. That allows us then to draw down Medicaid dollars from the federal government to take care of those prisoners. Actually, about $5.5 million put in for the local jail subsidy. We've got a considerable number of new beds coming online in our prison system this year, and that will help us take a lot of the prisoners out of the county jails that we're having to fund right now. Putting money into the Ag Commissioner's budget to help hire an H1A or H1B and H2A specialist in his office to help farmers and producers in the state manage through that system. Given the adoption of our immigration law last year, then it helps them go through and make sure they've got legal workers on the farm.
Changes made by House Appropriations bring the midterm budget to $8.5 billion. The House votes on the spending bill tomorrow. Also under the Gold Dome today, the Senate grants final passage to legislation that extends insurance agency licenses from 1 year to 2. That measure now goes to the governor. Legislation that raises the fee consumers pay when purchasing a new vehicle has cleared the Senate. Democrats say what's being called a fee is actually a tax.
If it is true that the Consumer Affairs Office took in and collected $539,000 in 2011, and we only appropriated $400,000, then the process should be, instead of it going back to the General Treasurer, it should go in the appropriation to move it up $100,000, rather than to place it upon our constituents to pay a $2 tax increase. These fees are being talked about in my district for in the last decade. They've talked about fees. No, you guys don't raise taxes, you just charge us fees.
That was Senator Steve Thompson. The measure narrowly passes by a vote of 30-19 and now goes to the House. Homeschool teachers will now have to submit attendance records directly and electronically to the Board of Education. Currently, the attendance records go to local school boards. Supporters say it's more efficient, while opponents believe that it limits local control.
Is this not taking it from local districts to the state level, which is now taken away from local control?
Well, it's not really any control. It's really a burden we're placing on the local school systems because there's no control they have over the reporting other than taking the reports and putting them in a file drawer, and then the superintendent has to write a letter when the homeschool parent requests the attendance letter for a driver's license. All this does is take where the reports are being filed, which will now be at the state level, which will be electronic. The local school systems will still have access to those records, but they won't be responsible for housing them.
That bill now goes to the House. Last year, the Supreme Court ruled that in garnishment proceedings, only lawyers had standing. Now, the Senate has voted to change the law so that authorized officers or employers can also answer. Senator Charlie Bethel explains.
And then not, the garnishment process involves an innocent third party who ends up being roped in to help pay off a debt. Recent decision out of the Georgia Supreme Court muddied the water about what an answer of a garnishee looks like and whether it constitutes a practice of law. We are trying to redefine in the code section that a garnishee's answer is a purely administrative function. It's a clerical function. It does not involve any legal skill or legal judgment.
Additionally, the Senate will allow companies to be repaid any costs involved in the collection of an employee's garnished wages. The bill now goes back to the House. Also passing the Senate today, a measure that penalizes anyone who falsely reports that they have committed a crime, and legislation that prohibits the use of boats in state parks, historic sites, and recreational areas. Both now go to the House. Reporting live from the state capitol, I'm Kiosha Howard for Primetime Lawmakers.
Pace is picking up. Thank you, Kiosha. If you've ever seen movies that portray domestic violence, such as Enough, starring Jennifer Lopez, you might have some idea what violence against women is like in the USA. However, nothing hits closer to home than hearing true stories of brave women in your own community. Primetime Lawmakers Jackie Britton was at the Capitol today to hear those women speak about their own inspiring stories.
The statistics are alarming.
57 counties in Georgia have no access to a state-certified sexual assault center.
The stories are troubling.
Gratitude for my and my children's survival of over 2 decades of violence and abuse.
But the effort and support to put an end to domestic violence against women is contagious.
Something has to change. Something must change. And I have faith that better days are ahead and something will change.
Several organizations to stop violence against women gathered in the rotunda today to raise support on 2 bills they believe will increase security for victims in domestic violence. A few very courageous women stepped forward to share their story.
You might have this picture that I was maybe on a street here in downtown Atlanta, in a darkened alley, or maybe, how about a parking garage? But I was not. I was walking inside a hotel just blocks from here, in an inside corridor. I had just stepped out of my room when the sexual assault began.
The Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence was one of many groups that came to the Capitol today in support of legislation to strengthen the safety of victims. One bill looks to protect the personal information between victims and advocates, and the other would allow law enforcement to take immediate action if an abuser violates a restraining order and returns to a victim. Both bills are currently awaiting a hearing in committee. For Primetime Lawmakers, I'm Jackie Britton.
It's Education Week here on Primetime Lawmakers, all part of GPB's effort to help improve the graduation rate. Every night this week, we're featuring a different education topic with expert guests to keep you informed on the important education issues in Georgia. Tonight, we're very happy to welcome 2 distinguished members of the Georgia House Education Committee, Chairman Brooks Coleman and Representative Amy Carter of Valdosta, to talk about inequality in rural schools. First of all, I'll ask you both, just as the toss-up question this evening, do we have inequality? Is it an issue we need to deal with, Representative Carter?
Well, I appreciate you having me here today. Thank you very much.
Certainly.
And I think probably the rural schools do feel at times that there's a little inequality. We're having to do extra things, be very creative with our class opportunities. Transportation can be an issue. I know of children who get up actually get on the bus at 6:30 in the morning and get home after 5 because of the routes within a large county, but yet with a smaller tax base. That is also a big issue for those school systems. The class opportunities, if you have only 300 students in a school, when it comes to outside of the academic classes, there's an issue with trying to find career, technical, agricultural education classes because of the numbers of students. You have to make a class, and if you only have 8 students who want to take the class, then you have to make a big decision.
We're going to get some detail on this, but first of all, Chairman Coleman, does it really come down to money? There's more money in heavier populated areas than less populated areas. I mean, you seem academic, but we need to point that out, right?
Well, I mean, it's a fact that if you live in an urban area, a big city, you have more businesses, you have more opportunities and more areas to draw money from. So typically a mill in a big urban area may generate $12 million a year, where one down in maybe Pelham City may generate $33,000 a year. So there is an inequity, and we realize this in the state, and so we created, and we've been studying this summer, we have created an Education Finance Study Commission, and we're looking at the whole thing of the QBE, the Quality Education Basic fund that funds education, and we've been looking at ways to try to do that. And we passed, as a matter of fact, today we passed 3 pieces of legislation that trying to address the inequities in our system.
Well, that's a little bit of news. Let's get right to that.
Right. One of them that we did was called the Equalization Bill. And what that does, that takes our schools and it ranks them from the wealthiest tax base to the poorest. And then we take the state average of that, and then at the state average, everything below the state average, we have allotted in the budget $438 million that we take and give to these poor systems so that we can equalize their meal up to what the state average is. So that way we're helping them there. Also, we have provided them, and we're looking at providing flexibility. So when they get their money, allow these systems to have the flexibility to spend it as they see the need, instead of, as in the past, the state directing, you'll spend this for this, and as Representative Carter said, they may not need a certain class, and they should spend their money for something else. And one of the big things we're doing in places like that, we provided virtual education. Amy, that's a great thing, because many times they can't offer physics or advanced science because they don't have enough students. So through the virtual program that has almost 10,000 students using it, they can tie into that. And the state board is providing extra technology down there where they can hook into that and get their courses that way.
Do you see a creative solution like online charter schools, for instance? That's what you're talking about?
That's what I'm talking, virtual school, virtual charter school.
And another option is dual enrollment, which we've seen great success in South Georgia, where the student is enrolled at the high school and also at either a technical college or a university, and they get credit for both places, but it's a great opportunity for the students to leave the campus and receive credits for items or classes that are not offered at the high school.
Yeah, especially some of the more technical things where you're right, you might only have 3 or 4 kids that are interested.
The greatest piece of education legislation I think we passed in the decade was House Bill 186. It was the career and technical education that allows that. It also allows students to exempt class seat time, something when we were in school you had to sit there. Even though you could pass the class, they can go ahead as a senior, take the course, take the test rather, pass it, move on to college. And children in the 9th or 10th grade that really don't want to stay in high school, they're ready to drop out, allow them to move on, as Ramey said, into the technical school and take electricity, take construction, and earn high school credit and technical credit.
Let's look at the issue of money in just a second here, because one of the biggest challenges that exist tonight is poverty. Percentage of rural students in poverty here in Georgia. According to a 2009 study by the Rural School and Community Trust Policy Program, 47.4% of Georgia's rural students are in poverty, compared to 40.6% in the USA. Now, what you're talking about, this equalization bill, that passed the committee today?
Passed the committee and going to the House floor, right.
So you actually would pump a little more state money into these counties, these systems that need it, so that pie chart's going to look a little different for them than it might for Metro Atlanta, let's say a Metro Atlanta school.
We're bringing their state allotment up to the state average of what the wealthiest schools have. And so we're equalizing their dollar up to, and of course we want them to help themselves. They have to tax themselves also, so we'll equalize every dollar up for after the first 5 meals up to 12 more meals. So that is wonderful for them.
Now, what are some of the more affluent school systems and affluent counties going to say about that? Because they're not going to have as much money to go around, right?
Well, you have your, as you say, your winners and your losers, but really, when you look at the metro area, most of them are not entitled to this equalization money because their tax base is so large that they have the money to choose from. So they realize this. So the ones above the state average, none of them receive this equalization money because their tax base is so large. Contrary to what people believe, one of the wealthiest counties, or the wealthiest in the state, is Greene County, which you would not realize because of the Lake Oconee. And then the second is Burt County because of Plant Vogel. So, they have lots of money for education.
You were making a point to Representative Carter about how this money is pushed around and spent?
Well, I was going to mention one of my counties is Brooks County, and just if we take two counties and compare them, Brooks County's median household income is $41,309, where Cobb County is $62,839. Also in Brooks, we have an 82% free and reduced lunch. But we're trying to find opportunities for students so that they can come out of the poverty issues that they're having in their communities, and you know, we're looking at creative ways to do that.
You mentioned this. I want to get into this in the few seconds we have left. How creative some of these teachers and school systems are in getting a quality education to these kids.
Well, to me personally, dual enrollment is by far the greatest thing, but Move On When Ready, of course, is a great opportunity. I know of plenty of students, numerous students throughout the state, who have graduated from high school and also had a certificate, like a 2-year certificate from a technical college at the same time. So we're able to get them out into the workforce immediately after high school.
Skills ready, which is very important, knowing how to do something after high school. Finally, Chairman Coleman, the charter schools movement, will that help rural schools? You know,
I'm a big advocate of charter schools, and what this is, we've got to realize charter schools and the charter school piece of legislation we passed today, they're public schools, and as the law says of the bill, the constitutional amendment, they would apply with a good idea, they would apply to their local boards. We want them to do that. We hope that the local boards will work with them and approve these schools. We've had some very good charter applications that have been turned down, and what this allows, if they are, they can apply to the state a state charter commission, and they could approve these. And one of the concerns that many of them had, they were afraid local money would be taken, but we changed that today. We talked with hundreds of board members and superintendents, and what we did, we took that out. This would be just state money going to the schools, and we also changed the constitutional wording so that it was more acceptable.
That's a very huge part of this, and we're going to be following. Thank you both so much for joining us this evening. We sure appreciate that. One correction from last night's broadcast at a story on anti-hazing. We mistakenly referred to former Representative Terry Lawler as former Lieutenant Governor Pierre Howard. We apologize for the error and have corrected the story in our online version of our program, available at gpb.org/lawmakers. We're going to take a short break. Don't go anywhere. We're going to analyze some of the hot button issues at the Gold Dome. Walter Jones of the Morris News Service will join us in just a moment. Welcome back to Primetime Lawmakers. We're nearing the end of a busy 5-day week under the Gold Dome. We've seen some action on a number of important issues over the last several days. I'm joined in studio now by Walter Jones. He's the Atlanta Bureau Chief of Morris News Service. He's been covering Georgia politics for 14 years, and I often read Walter's stuff online and learn things, because you seem to be in the right place at the right time. Like tonight, when we heard something new about the charter schools resolution that would amend the Georgia Constitution to allow states charter schools.
Well, a lot of people thought that was going to be the big fight of the session because there was a lot of controversy around the Supreme Court issue. The whole idea of taking what opponents said was some local money and moving it at state fiat seemed to bother people. But the committee today agreed to an amendment that changed that. So now it's only going to be state money, and I guess the state can do what they want with their own money.
Well, so that means that someone could apply for a state charter if the county won't allow it. Let's say the Gwinnett County is not fond of the charter school movement, is what I can tell.
Clearly.
The administration is not. You heard from J. Alvin Wilbanks a little earlier tonight. So they could apply, and their charter school will be run by state money, not by local money.
Well, yeah, I mean, they could still have a locally granted charter school with local money, but yeah, the big hurdle was taking the money. The locals said, well, you don't take your money away from our other schools, and give it to the charter school.
The biggest thing they're going to do under the Gold Dome, of course, every year is the budget. And they're moving like greased lightning now. It seems all of a sudden the amended budget, the little budget, the rest of 2012 is going to be voted on the House tomorrow.
Yeah, it zipped right along. They really didn't fight over a whole lot. Well, of course, it's early. They could still end up fighting over it in the Senate, but I doubt it. Most of the changes are not significant in the amended budget. Of course, the reason for it is to account for population changes in the school enrollment since the last budget was passed. And other than that, one of the biggest areas in it that I thought was kind of interesting is it frees up $700 million that had been sort of in an accounting backwater in the Department of Transportation. You remember a few years ago, they had an issue where they were using one form of accounting, accrual accounting, and then audits came in and said, well, you're not accounting for money and you've lost money, and they switched to cash accounting. In that switch, somehow or another, they ended up with $700 million in gas tax money that they've got available now for construction projects. And so that's a pretty big chunk to suddenly free up.
Boy, I'll say. All right, it'll be interesting to see how many hands come out for that money. $700 million is a good chunk, you're right.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, other issues here. I was talking to House Majority Leader O'Neill today about the potential for tax reform. And he says, yes, there's a great push behind the energy sales tax exemption to make it more palatable for business to work here.
What did he say, how to pay for it?
Well, he said something interesting to me today. He says, we're going to phase it in small increments. We're going to start it to show business we're serious about it. And so we don't have to take the $100 to $150 million chunk immediately. There's obviously no appetite for that. There's no money for that. So does that make it more palatable?
Yeah, clearly. I think that's something that'll sail through the legislature. Even the minority has said they're for it. They think that it makes sense, that it's a good thing. The big issue has always been how to pay for it. And the choice was either to find another source of money, and Republicans weren't going to raise taxes, which meant cutting that much money from something, or phasing it in. And the phasing in, like I say, has always been the more palatable option.
It looks like that's what they're going to do if the House Majority Leader has his way. Meanwhile, one more thing here.
I'm sure he will.
Yes, he usually does, so that's why he's the Majority Leader. Yeah. One more thing here, hot button issues. You're not hearing many things like that. Any of the Christian conservative issues, for instance, like, let's say anything to do with abortion, or even any of these the gun legislation laws that we've been hearing about on the fringe.
Yeah, there really hadn't been a whole lot percolating about that yet, but those bills haven't gone away. There's bills that were introduced pre-filed before the session started. One that would have done away with concealed carry permits. So in other words, anybody could carry a concealed weapon. You wouldn't have to apply for it with a probate judge. And so we'll see. I mean, that's still sort of working its way through. I assume the committee will call it eventually.
Okay.
And there was an interesting press conference I went to this week. Jeff Chapman, who ran for the governor, came up short in the Republican nomination, but he's now with a new group that is going to set up a sort of an online scorecard for legislators, and it's sponsored by the conservative end of the Tea Party group.
We're going to get you back on that, okay?
Okay.
Walter, good to see you again.
Sure.
Coming up tomorrow on Lawmakers, following today's passage by the Appropriations Committee, the House is expected to vote on the FY 2012 supplemental budget. We'll take a look at the week in review, highlights of important stories, and I'll be joined on set by Buddy Darden and Bill Crane for behind-the-scenes analysis and commentary. This is going to be a good ride tomorrow night. If you missed any part of this broadcast, it repeats tomorrow morning at 5:30. Coming up next, it's Georgia Outdoors. Host Sharon Collins will explore Georgia's two canyons. Georgia Outdoors, Grand Canyons, is coming up next here on GPB. And that's our broadcast for this 13th legislative day of the 2012 session. I'm Scott Slade. We'll be here tomorrow night at 7 for Primetime Lawmakers. Happy Groundhog Day, everybody. General Lee says spring is right around the corner.
This is a GPB original production.